This is Dateline News and Conversation. Tonight, part two with Sylvia Demarest. We were talking last week about Israel and the genocide in Gaza, the influence that Israel has, and we were talking about the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, commonly known as AIPAC. And this week we're going to continue discussing it because it is of enormous importance, and I don't think enough people really understand how important it is. So, Sylvia, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Regis, how you doing?
Really well, thanks. AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, they basically control the Jewish community in the United States. What do they do, and how do they work with major Jewish organizations to keep the American Jewish community in line?
Well, there's a major organization called the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, and it's 51 organizations that are assumed under this one organization. And so what that means is that AIPAC has allies in every community in the United States, throughout the United States. And so what we really need to do, Regis, is to ask our brothers and sisters in the Jewish community to take a look at this situation and to determine if it's time now to try to forge a different relationship given everything that's going on. And there are a lot of Jews, as we talked about the last time, that are not Zionists, and there are a lot of Zionists that are not Jews. And so there has been within the Jewish community for a long time an effort being made to try to break free of some of these associations and to have a broader policy where Israel is concerned. But there's also a lot of effort within the Jewish community, similar to the effort outside the Jewish community, to control dissent and to keep people on the same track. And so the same way that we are demonized and canceled if we violate the narrative, so are many Jewish people violated and canceled. And given the power of the Zionist Jewish community within Hollywood and media and Wall Street and major banks and major law firms, it has serious consequences. So this is going to have to be a struggle of love and compassion, not only within the broader community, but within the Jewish community as well, to try to forge some kind of alliance that would allow reason and compassion and love and understanding to predominate. I was talking to some friends locally who've had Jewish members onto their board for various, peace organizations. And when things got heavy and hot in Israel and those organizations tried to tell the truth, these people advised them that they had to leave the board because they were getting too much heat from within their community. So this is not a struggle that, any one of us or any group of us within the United States can undertake. It takes the entire community of the United States, including the love and compassion of our Jewish friends, to be able to finally change this dynamic and see a return to reason in terms of U.S. policy for Israel. And I know people think that this is not possible, but you see breaks in this community. This is why it's so important that survivors of the Holocaust and their family and relatives join forces with the protests against the genocide in Israel. That's why it's so important to see Jews like Naomi Klein try to separate Zionism from Judaism. That's why it's so important for us to see these increase in articles that actually discuss what's going on beyond what's been allowed in the narrative. And maybe through these actions, we can begin to break through what is a very, very strong and powerful organization that consists of 14,000 volunteers, billions of dollars in terms of ability to not only control the narrative, but to elect Congress, to manage the presidency, and to take full control over U.S. policy over Israel.
All right, I have to ask you this. It would seem to me that AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and all of its organizations in every state in the country appear to be controlled by Zionists. What is your thought on that? I mean, it looks, I mean, how many are, this is really baffling to me. The Jewish community is enormous in the United States. It's a very large voting bloc. But how many of these Jews, religious, biblical Jews, are Zionists, or how many Zionists are there that really control what's going on? It's hard for me to get my head around that.
Well, you know, we talked about the last time the fact that 6 of the 10 most wealthy people in the United States were Jewish, and that a large percentage of the top 25 were Jewish, and that between 30 and 40% of all billionaires in the United States are Jewish. For some reason, these Jewish billionaires seem to be predominantly Zionist. Now, that does not mean that the Jewish community is predominantly Zionist. But when you have that much concentration of wealth and power and the ability to fund the Zionists that do exist and the pro-Israeli groups that do exist, they are able to exercise a far disproportionate degree of power than they have numbers to support. And so while we don't have a survey that actually tells us how many and what percentage of the Jewish community is Zionist, it does appear to me that a majority of the Jewish billionaires are Zionists, and their money has talked in the past and continues to talk. And we see that in the current crisis, where it was these Zionist billionaires that took on the universities and tried to shut down any discussion of what's going on in Israel. So it's a very powerful group, even though it's a small group.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that clarification. So how do they exercise power and authority over Jews who dissent and Jews who have reservations about the Israeli actions in Gaza? How do they control these people?
Same way they control all of us. They used humiliation, exclusion from community, domination, blackballing, and those kinds of techniques to let Jews know that if they object to what's going on, they are not going to be welcome within the larger Jewish community. And I think up to now, this has been effective, but Regis, you know, when you see this level of radicalism and fanaticism going on in Israel, and when you see that the current Israeli government, that there's no depth to which they will not sink in this current crisis, you know, that turns everybody inward to look at where we are in terms of our values and our compassion. And I think that is a conversation that's going on right now in Israel. And the question is, will the world be upended in Gaza? Because what is involved is not only this unified approach to protecting Israel, which seems to, in the past at least, to have gotten stronger and stronger the worse Israel acted. All of these groups and all of these Jews felt instinctively that they had to act to protect Israel, given the way Israel was behaving. But at some point, the behavior becomes so extreme that you can no longer support, from a moral standpoint, continuing to be supportive and to be silenced. And, I think one of the reasons so many billionaires are supportive is that they see their own demise in the demise of Israel, because their own power seems to be wrapped up in this history of colonialism, which and persecution, which persists in Israel. So there's a lot here in terms of history that needs to be turned around. And it's not easy to turn it around, but there's a process that's ongoing. And at some point, I hope it becomes an avalanche, and that people all together stand up and recognize that this needs to stop. I practiced law for years with a large number of Jewish lawyers. There have been a number of doctors that have treated me that have been Jewish, and these are some of the most ethical, uh, the most professional, and the most intelligent people I have ever dealt with. And the entire purpose and extent of the Jewish religion is one of ethics and morality. And so I can't imagine that what we see going on now in Gaza can be continued over a long period of time, by a group of people that are characterized by their intelligence and their morality and their ethics. It just isn't possible for that to persist. At least that's my hope.
Yeah. And one of the reasons that AIPAC has been so successful uh, is because they not only provide funds, but they provide information. They provide, and that information to the Jewish community all over the United States. And therefore, they are a very powerful voting bloc. Um, and so I get that. I just didn't realize how powerful it was. I thought it was just a matter of, AIPAC and money from these billionaires going to all members of Congress.
There's an infrastructure that extends throughout the United States, and that infrastructure is not only to elect Congress. That infrastructure is to control information, to make sure that the information you want gets out, and that the information that you don't want to get out is controlled. It also provides assistance to various organizations. It coordinates responses to things that go on. If something happens and you get one response from one corner, that has one impact. But when the response comes from all over the United States and impacts everything from the local to the state level to the national level to the international level, that's real power. And that is what this group, because it's not just AIPAC. It's AIPAC and its affiliated organizations, which are numerous and which exist all over the United States and which are coordinated. Because remember, AIPAC has this huge building in Washington, D.C., which they've just added 2 floors to. They're building another huge building right next door to house the infrastructure and the employees that they have that coordinate all of this. It's a very, very well organized, well coordinated organization, and it's a well organized, well coordinated response. And that's what all these people are doing. They are keeping tabs on everything that's going on. They are responding to everything that's going on. They are meeting and coordinating the response, and they are doing it with the best tools available in cooperation with outside groups that are expert in propaganda, media, all of that. It is a very, very formidable organization, but it depends on the complete cooperation of the Jewish community. Individuals within the Jewish community can band together and change this dynamic. That's why I'm appealing to our brothers and sisters, our fellow citizens within the Jewish community. This is harming not only the United States and Israel, but Jews themselves. And it's being done in your name and against your will. And the only way this will change is if you help us change it.
Yeah, you mentioned the media, and the media is basically entirely controlled by a handful of Jewish billionaires, and that goes for Hollywood. So when you control the medium, where people get their information from, your power is just about absolute. Now,
Well, people are beginning to recognize that, and they're beginning to recognize what they're getting from these organizations, and that's propaganda, censorship, information control, and demonization. And so all of this is all part of a system of control. Israel and what's going on in Israel is only one small part of that. We across the West have seen a situation where wealth is extremely concentrated, where our governments no longer represent the will of the people and no longer act on behalf of the well-being of these people. And so all of this is bound together, and all of this is feared by the same group of powerful people who are backing Israel. And so that's part of what people need to understand, is that this is a larger battle. And right now it's focused on Israel, but it's a larger battle than that.
yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I was surprised to learn that evangelical Christians in large numbers support Israel. I don't understand that. Do you have any insight on that? I mean, they represent an awful lot of people.
Well, it's an important part of the entire ecosystem that benefits Israel. And this is tied to some of this religiosity and religious fanaticism and mythology and all of that. Um, Evangelicals believe, apparently, that in order for Jesus to come back, that Israel has to occupy all of ancient Israel, and that the Jewish temple needs to be rebuilt on the Temple Mount. Now, there's already an Arab mosque there, and if that mosque has to be destroyed to build a Jewish temple, you can imagine what all of that means. But this is all part of Revelations and the coming apocalypse. And what Christians believe, and there's been a whole series of books about this, is that believing Christians will be taken up bodily into heaven, and that they will watch the apocalypse take place, which will result in the forced conversion of Jews to Christianity before Jesus comes back. Now, this is not a particularly inviting point of view, but the important thing to remember here, I think, is that once again, this is changing. Young evangelicals do not go along with this and are increasingly not in support of what they see taking place in Israel. Because remember, the New Testament kind of resulted in a dichotomy between the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament was a God of vengeance and war and destruction. And the God of the New Testament, is embodied by Jesus, as a God of love and compassion and inclusion and love thy neighbor. Well, I hope that can predominate, and that people can see that we can't live in a world where certain groups are subject to genocide, to occupation, and to theft. And I see that happening increasingly within the evangelical community. Now, one of the results of this has been, because so many evangelicals are also Republican, there is still a greater percentage of Republicans that support current Israeli policy than do current Democrats. At present, a majority of the American people are opposed to U.S. policy in Israel. And that's the vast majority of independents and a small majority of Democrats. But the percentages would be larger if there wasn't a large percentage of Republicans who still supported U.S. policy in Israel.
Yeah, well said. What are other ways that AIPAC works to influence Congress, other people? I mean, I've been reading that the United States is sending police forces from around the country to Israel for training. I have to imagine AIPAC must be involved in some of that as well.
Absolutely.
But tell me a little bit about what else they do to encourage people to be pro-Israel.
Well, they focus on power centers. And one of the big power centers in Washington, D.C. is think tank land. And so AIPAC has infiltrated the largest think tanks in Washington, D.C. And that even includes liberal think tanks like the Brookings Institute, where a major Jewish donor to the Democratic Party has organized within the Brookings Institute a section dealing with Israel. And he says, I am a one issue man, and my issue is Israel. So think tanks are where policy initiatives get started. There were position papers get written. There were ideas come from. They were there. This is where ideas that infiltrate throughout society generate and become entrenched. And so when you have a huge presence in think tank land, and when you can control the output of think tank land, and when you can make sure that that output supports Israel and does not support any alternative view other than U.S. policy towards Israel, that's an enormous impact on the way that policy develops. And yes, AIPAC is also involved in several other initiatives. The first is, as you've described, sending police forces to Israel for training. And what do they get training in? They get training in how Israel controls crowds, how Israel deals with protesters, how Israel deals with dissent. And you can see that playing out now in how these police forces are dealing with protesters. They're doing it in a very violent way, where police dressed up in riot gear with all of this stuff come along and just go to town. AIPAC also sends members of Congress to Israel for indoctrination. They do that every year, full expense paid. And every member of Congress ends up going to Israel. They also send young people to Israel. I really wanted to find a video that I saw of how they recruit these young people. The video showed them going to a school class, and the kids looked like they were about 12 years old. And they were like, does anybody want to go to Israel? And these kids were literally jumping up and down. Yes, I want to go to Israel. Yes, I want to go. And then they followed up on some of these kids. Some of them actually joined the Israeli Defense Forces. And then they interviewed some of these kids. And some of them sounded like me. One of them said, I read Leon Uris just like I did. I believed all the propaganda just like I did. And then he had the experience of actually seeing how the occupation brutalizes innocent people. And so because of this, they began to turn around. But for a long time, through these efforts, they have been able to control the behavior of police forces, control the behavior of Congress, and to indoctrinate young people.
These young people that they're inviting to Israel, are they all Jews, or are any of them Gentiles?
They're all Jews.
Ah, wow. Yeah, so they've really figured out.
They're indoctrinating the next generation.
Yeah, wow.
But the indoctrination is backfiring. We have reached a point, and I hope we make this point over and over and over again, where the very worst in the history of Israel have come to power. Netanyahu's bad, but you get rid of him, there's 3 or 4 right behind him that are as bad or worse. It's almost as though the Israeli government can't plumb deeper depths of depravity than they are plumbing right now. And this is a long process. It has been, Israel wasn't envisioned as that type of country or that type of society. This has developed slowly over the years as the result of things that occurred during the history of Israel, which I hope we get an opportunity to discuss.
Yeah, well, we will, if not tonight, at some point, Sylvia, because we're on a roll. I want to shift gears slightly. The United States just passed, the Congress and the president signed it, a $91 billion aid package. $61 billion of that was going to Ukraine. I think something like $20 billion is going to go to Israel, which is more than I think we give them in a year.
Oh my God!
Yeah. How does this happen? Aren't there laws and legal reasons that would prohibit the United States for giving military financial aid to Israel?
Absolutely. First, there's the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. Israel not only did not sign the nuclear proliferation treaty, it secretly became a nuclear power state. This is a very dangerous proposition, particularly given the characters of the Jewish government that are currently in charge of Israel. The U.S. law prohibits any aid to a country that refuses to sign the nuclear proliferation treaty and secretly develops nuclear weapons. That has been going on. We've known that for decades. And yet we've continued to give $4 billion every year to Israel and all the military aid that they need. In addition to that, the international law is against genocide, which is what's going on in Israel. The Israeli occupation is illegal and has been. It's illegal to conduct ethnic cleansing, which Israel is doing in the West Bank and desires to do in Gaza. And now we have a new report that just came out a week or so ago, where under an edict from the Biden administration, an examination was conducted of Israel's conduct before and during the Gaza war. And they found several violations of U.S. law there, including the fact that Israel is making it difficult for U.S. aid to get to the people in Gaza. So there have been numerous reasons over a number of years why this aid should have been stopped a long time ago. And the point I want to make here is that it is our money, U.S. money and U.S. support, that has enabled Israel to do all of these things. Israeli society did not pay for these wars, has basically not really paid for the occupation, and is not paying for the weapons that they're using to genocide the people of Gaza. The people of the United States have paid for that over many years. Over the years, we've given Israel at least $1/3 of $1 trillion in aid, and now that aid has increased. And yes, it's true, Congress has passed a new aid bill, and that bill is for $26 billion for Israel. So we are basically enabling Israel to violate international law and U.S. law and conduct ethnic cleansing and genocide, and we are paying for all of that.
Well, it begs the question, how do they get away with it? How do they get away with it? I think I know the answer to that, but
well,
tell me.
The West is unfortunately still in charge of the world, okay? Israel is a nuclear power state. If you want to have your major city blown up, if you're in the Middle East, then do something that Israel doesn't like. It's a huge, huge, huge threat that Israel is holding over everyone's head. So the people, the governments of the West are in the same way that the United States government is controlled. It's controlled by these Zionist interests in the same way and with the same kind of power and influence that we've been discussing that's going on in the United States. Now, the rest of the world is against this. And the Arab population, 1 billion people across the world, is against this. But unfortunately, given Israel's military power and given the fact that Israel is a nuclear power state, without the United States stepping in and if we don't put our foot down, we are the ones that have to put our foot down. If we don't do that, I don't think any of this will be stopped.
Yeah. Well, again, the people with money can break all the laws and never get prosecuted. The behavior of the United States now, just totally ignoring and trampling on international law, the UN Charter, with their rules-based order. And Israel recently saying the International Criminal Court has no authority over it. And the United States said that. You don't have any authority to pass judgment on Netanyahu and his cabal. And so it's not just money, but it's this position of the hegemon who's allowing international law and the UN Charter, Human Rights Commission to be totally flaunted.
Who's at this point, given everything that we've discussed, who's the major criminal here? Is it the criminal that's actually firing the gun, Or is it the person that gave the criminal the gun, knowing that the criminal would fire the gun? The United States, our leadership, is the one that's giving Israel the weapons and the support and the cover to engage in this kind of atrocity. And so if the leadership of Israel is going to be issued an arrest warrant by the court, the international court, then shouldn't an arrest warrant be issued for the president of the United States as well? And I want to digress here because we may not get to this, because I want people to know. Back in 1981, there had been a horrific campaign, a false flag operation that had been conducted by Israel involving suicide bombings all across Lebanon. And then when the Palestinians didn't react to the horrific bombings, which we really need to discuss, a new and young Israel invaded, and then a young senator from the United States visited Israel, and he was so enthusiastic about Israel's invasion of Lebanon, which had killed thousands of people and utterly destroyed Beirut. Then he went to Menachem Begin and said, I think you should go further, and I don't think you should be concerned about the welfare of women and children. That young senator was Joseph Robinette Biden. And here's what Menachem Begin, who had led a terrorist organization before the founding of Israel, said to Senator Biden. It is against the moral qualms of Israel and the morality of the Israeli people to target women and children. Now, two things here. Number one, that a U.S. senator would be encouraging that kind of behavior in a foreign country. And number two, look at the degree to which Israeli society has declined from 1982, when a former terrorist, who is now the prime minister of Israel, had a higher moral code than a young senator from the United States who went on to become the president. It's a terrible story, and it should be shocking to every American to hear that. And unfortunately, Joe Biden is not alone. There are many, many people in Congress and within the administration who feel the same way. And it's this kind of attitude that allows these atrocities to persist.
Well, it's not surprising that one Joseph Biden is fully supporting Ukraine in this war against the United States. And it's not a proxy war, in my opinion. It's a direct war. When you give over $100 billion to Ukraine in weapons and aid to prop up their government, you're giving them long-range ballistic missiles. You're in a direct conflict. Same thing.
You want World War. That is what this is leading to, unless saner heads and minds intervene. It's leading to a situation where a mistake can lead to World War. But before we leave this subject, I want to point out that it's not just Biden and every previous American president that's kowtowed to this kind of policy involving Israel. It's impossible for anybody to run for the presidency or to serve in the presidency unless they have the same attitude towards Israel. I supported RFK Jr. and gave him some money and in hopes that he would have a different point of view. And then he gave an interview to Jimmy Dore where it was the same kind of misinformation and lies. And, you know, I did a memo for him in order to try to correct some of these misimpressions. And I was supposed to meet with him at a fundraiser, but things got changed. But I did visit with his campaign manager at the time. And I gave him the memo that I'd done, and I asked that he visit with RFK about it. Well, 2 days later, that campaign manager had been fired, and a new campaign manager had been put into effect. And now let's talk about Donald Trump, because a lot of people have hopes that Donald Trump, who did not start a new war when he was president, would not be as crazy about Israel as some of these other things. But you know, remember I told you that AIPAC had humiliated every American president but one, and that one was Donald J. Trump. And the reason that AIPAC did not have to humiliate Donald Trump was because Donald Trump did everything Israel wanted. He allowed them to annex the Golan Heights. He moved the United States embassy to Jerusalem. He murdered Soleimani, who was on a recognized peace mission on behalf of the United States, Israel, Lebanon, and Iraq. He flew on a commercial airline in his own name. Everybody knew when he would arrive in Iraq and who would pick him up, and that person was a high up official in the Iraqi government. They knew what route they would take to the peace meeting. And what happened during that route? The United States fired a missile and killed Soleimani and his driver. And that was ordered and approved by Donald J. Trump. So we have a situation where no matter who you are, if you have desires to be president of the United States in this environment, you have to kowtow to a foreign government and the requirements of a foreign government rather than the best interest of the people of the country you are running to represent. And that is a tragedy.
Well said. And it must be said. You mentioned a couple of terrorist actions. I want to move now to something we've talked about. Can you discuss how Zionism and Zionist terrorist groups have used organized violence and terrorism to achieve the establishment of the State of Israel?
This is an enormous topic. As you know, in my first outline, I tried to discuss some of this, but it would be like a 3-hour conversation, if not a week-long conversation. So I'm just going to hit the high points. With the beginning of the colonization of Palestine, it soon became clear to the residents that these Zionist settlers had no intention of living together with the current population. And so there was an effort made to purchase land, and some land was purchased, and the Palestinians that were living on that land were expelled, and that began to create tensions. And so those tensions led to the formation of various Zionist terrorist groups, as well as a violent reaction on the part of the Arab community. In fact, there was an Arab war that was fought from 1932 to 1936, which the British opposed with hundreds of thousands of troops. And this ended up being a tragedy for the Palestinians because they were vanquished, their weapons were seized, and their leaders were expelled. Subsequent to that, these Jewish gangs decided that they wanted to do everything that was necessary to require the UK to change its policy. The British, the UK, had a policy where they were interested in establishing a binational state. And the Zionist settlers did not want a binational state. They wanted a Jewish state. So this commenced a regime of terrorism that was directed against the British that involved some horrific acts of terrorism. And those acts included not only attacks against British soldiers and British installations, but I'll go on to name a few. From 1944 to 1948, there was an extensive campaign of terrorism involving hundreds of terrorist acts that was directed against the British and the Arabs all over the Palestinian Mandate. In 1944, a man by the name of Walter Edward Genesis, who was the first Baron Monnier, and he was the British representative in Palestine. He was assassinated by a gang that the first Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion, authorized. And then on November the 8th, then on July the 22nd, a Jewish gang, the Stern Gang, bombed the administrative and military headquarters of the UK in the King David Hotel, killing 91 people. And then in July of 19 1947, the Stern Gang organized a letter bomb campaign throughout Britain. They sent letter bombs to every representative in Parliament, including Winston Churchill. And then on September 17th of 1948, the Stern Gang assassinated the representative of the of UN, the mediator, a man by the name of Count Folke Bernadette. He and his aide were ambushed leaving Cairo and were assassinated. Why did that happen? Because Count Bernadette insisted on allowing the Palestinians who had been expelled from Israel to return. And that could not be tolerated. So we have this extensive history of all sorts of terrorist campaigns that were initiated and run for a couple of decades before 1948, all leading up to what's called the Nakba, which is where all of these Zionist gangs coalesced in order to, through the use of terrorism, rape, torture, and other techniques. They forced 700,000 Palestinians to flee in fear of their lives. Those people were never allowed to return, and that has led to the current situation that we have today. So three individuals who became prime ministers of Israel were involved in terrorism prior to the establishment of the state of Israel. And that kind of history became ingrained, I think, through these actions into subsequent actions, at least in terms of what was allowed as the scope of those actions, and led to the situation in part that we have today.
Well, and there's one act of terrorism that the Zionists, Israeli government, inflicted on the United States was in June of 1967. They bombed the USS Liberty, a information gathering ship that was in international waters, and that was completely covered up. Justice was never had for.
Here's what I understand went on with that. That ship had the capacity to collect all sorts of signal intelligence. And what I understand was going on at that time, this was the 1967 war, there was a real question about the treatment of Egyptian prisoners of war that Israel had captured. And I think Israel was concerned that their treatment of these prisoners of war and other things that they were involved in would become known. And so the Liberty was flying the American flag, and there wasn't just one attack. There were repeated attacks in an effort to sink that ship. And finally, another American ship came to its aid, and the attack ceased. But all of the survivors of the Liberty have all testified that they felt like the action that was taken by Israel was intentional and intended to kill them all and to sink the ship. And you're right. Lyndon Johnson was president at that time, and he was in no mood to do anything that was contrary to his complete support of Israel. And so he completely shut down that investigation. And the people that were injured in that attack have not had justice to this very day.
Yeah. I'm happy to highlight that as well. We're talking about violence, and violence begets violence. The state of Israel has been using violence, obscene violence, and terrorism since the very beginning, as you've just outlined. Let's talk a little bit now about how violence begets violence and becomes ingrained in a society, not just Ukraine, I'm sorry, not just Israel, but that's the topic that we're discussing right now.
Yeah, and I want to make one thing clear. This is not a policy that all of Israel and all the citizens of Israel support. This was not the Israel that was intended to be created. The Israel that was intended to be created was an Israel that was progressive and inclusive and uh, and and was a leading light in terms of progressive policies globally. But there was this small faction within Israel, within the Zionist community, because not all people that went to Israel fully supported the Zionist movement. Uh, Many did not. They simply wanted to be citizens of another state. But this small group persisted, and over time achieved greater and greater and greater authority, particularly since they used every opportunity to defeat any process for peace, to provoke the Palestinians into uh, violent actions that could be used to expand their power and authority. Because remember what I said earlier: occupied people have the right to resist. Occupied people have the right to attack their occupiers. For many, many decades, there was no attention was paid to the Palestinian plight. And it was only when Palestinians began to rebel that people started paying more attention to what was going on in Palestine. But the narrative creation machine categorized all of those actions on the part of the Palestinians as terrorism. And the fear that was provoked in all of that was used by this small group of people to expand their authority and to increase the ability to use excessive violence and extensive violence throughout the occupied territories. And so that's kind of the history of how this came about. But the persistence of violence and the continued use of violence and the entrenchment of violence becomes embedded and endemic within a society over time. And this is what's happened within Israel. There have been mistakes also on the part of the Palestinian resistance, as I mentioned in the other interview, when the second intifada occurred and suicide bombings were used. That was a terrible mistake. That targeted civilians, and that's wrong, no matter who does it. Whether it was the Jewish terrorist gangs that did it before the establishment of Israel, whether it's the Jewish occupation of the West Bank that's doing it, whether it's the bombing of Gaza that targets civilians. The targeting of civilians is a violation of international law, and no one was using it. But this small group of right-wing fanatics and left-wing fanatics and religious fanatics within Israel used all of that in an effort to entrench themselves into power, and it has worked. So Israel's occupation is the longest occupation in modern history. And over time, what has happened within that occupation has been that greater and greater and greater violence has been employed with less and less restraint and more brutality. And I think we are finally beginning to have people discuss in authorized media within the United States the extent of some of that violence. And so this was, let me close with this. There was an IDF officer who said that the Palestinians that we're fighting today are the babies we did not kill when we had the opportunity to do so. Can you imagine that statement coming from a high-ranking officer who should be someone who has affinity and loyalty to the laws of war, which prohibit anything like that? And now maybe we can understand that a society can fall to such depths to where IDF snipers will shoot babies in the head, as they're doing in Gaza.
Let's talk a little bit about the IDF and the indoctrination. Every citizen, man and woman of Israel, has to serve a period of time in the IDF, the Israeli military. They go through indoctrination. Could this be how so many of these IDF military people can be so obscenely violent to shooting kids in the head? It's ubiquitous. It seems like they must all be this way.
Well, what we have here is a society where hate is going out of control, and where fanaticism has gone out of control, and where over a long period of time, they've been able to characterize an entire group of people as less than human, and where has been determined that these people can be subjected to any kind of treatment. I sent to you an essay that was written recently in the London Review of Books. And what that essay showed, and this is based on facts, this is not hyperbole, okay? What this essay showed was the degree of violence that the IDF in all of these situations, including Israeli prisons, have been directing against women. And that includes sexual violence, sexual humiliation, the photographing of these women in sexualized positions, beatings, etc. And shame is a big part of Palestinian society, and they post these pictures online, or they use these pictures as blackmail to keep these women from talking about the treatment that they were subjected to. And one of the things in this essay that just went all over me is the fact that at the time of the beginning of this particular campaign in Gaza, 50,000 Palestinian women were pregnant. And as a result of the deprivation and the destruction of healthcare and the deprivation of food and water and healthcare, many of these women have lost their babies, and many of these babies are being born with low birth rates and subsequently dying. So the numbers that we hear about the civilian casualties in Gaza is dramatically understated. It's a much larger casualty list than that, and includes all these women and their babies. It's a very distressing situation. The essay is by Azadeh Mavani, and it's in the new edition of the London Review of Books, and it's called "What They Did to Our Women." And I urge everybody to read it.
Well, tell me a little bit more about what they're doing. Are they capturing women, imprisoning them, and then all of this torture and rape takes place?
Well, here's what happens. First of all, in the West Bank, in order to go anywhere, you got to go through 512 checkpoints that are all manned by the IDF. At those checkpoints, they humiliate people constantly. They select and humiliate women. If they're feeling like it that day, they arrest them and put them in prison, where all those people in the prison who've been torturing people since decades ago, as was revealed in 1977, where they were using the same torture techniques that they taught to the United States at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, and they torture these people. So once this kind of feeling of these people are less than human, you can have fun with them, it's okay to kill them, it's okay to humiliate them, it's okay to torture them. This is what happens on an ongoing basis. It's terrifying, and it needs to stop. We are not animals. As human beings, we are moral creatures. We live by the laws of morality. Look at babies. A little baby knows what's right and wrong, knows what's fair and unfair. Let's have that attitude. Love our neighbors. Let's get together and do something about this spread of this level of vicious totalitarianism that is going to destroy the world if it's allowed to continue to spread.
I'm very concerned about that, because we can see this totalitarianism, fascism springing up all over.
It's a big problem. It's
yeah,
a big authoritarianism within liberal society all over the place. I know we're running out of time, and before we leave, I'm going to interject here because I want to say something that needs to be said. Throughout all of this, Israel purchased 7% of the land before the UN mandate. The UN mandate gave them 54%. Not that they were supposed to get all that land, but that was supposed to be the Israeli state. As a result of the Nakba, they expelled 700,000 Palestinians and took all of that land. Now they're in the 67 war. They assumed control over the West Bank and over Gaza. They have been in the process of stealing the land in the West Bank consistently, persistently over all that period of time. And now the Israeli Defense Forces are in the process of, I think, expelling the population of Gaza, which is before the war 2.3 million people. I want to make one point here. Not 1 cent of compensation has been paid to any of the people who lost their property and lost their land. Not 1 cent, even though there are Israelis that are living in Palestinian houses to this day. The other thing is Egypt just leased a small section of the Egyptian coast to the UAE for $40 billion, much smaller than Gaza. Can you imagine what Gaza would be worth if the Palestinians were expelled? Finally, there's an enormous find of oil and gas resources off the coast of Gaza worth billions, maybe trillions of dollars. That should belong to the Palestinians. If the Israelis are successful in expelling the Palestinians from Gaza, I'm sure that will be confiscated, because Israel has made sure that no Palestinian can go more than a short distance from the coast of Gaza without being shot. So they've prevented any effort to explore or to exploit these resources. So if you take all of that into consideration, what we've seen is the theft of hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars from the Palestinian people. Yes, although Israel hasn't provided any assistance, the Palestinian people have been assisted by various governments around the world, but that's only because Israel has made sure that they're unable to in any way develop their own societies, start businesses and act as free men in order to develop their own prosperity. And so I want people to understand the consequences that have befallen these people in terms of what they've lost. And I don't think anybody's talking about that. And it's time that we discuss it.
You've mentioned two things that are really important, and I want to finish on this note for tonight. You've talked about being human, and being human means acting according to a moral, ethical code. But the Israelis do not consider the Palestinians to be human. They refer to them as dogs or animals. Sylvia, one last comment. Is this racist? Is this a racist problem
Sure.
between?
Sure. I mean, this is overt racism, but I also want to point out, just like we can't, describe all Jews as being of a certain quality, we can't characterize Israeli society in that way either. There is a tremendous amount of dissent and division within Israeli society. Many Israelis do not agree with these practices. They are just not in the majority given the divisions. The other day I was watching, and there had been protests in Tel Aviv to against what was going on in Gaza, and in order to get the Israeli government to get the hostages released. And at the end of that protest, I saw a video of them cleaning up, and the streets were filled with blood. This is Israeli blood being shed in an effort to stop the depravity that they're seeing within their own government. So we need to join forces with the Israelis that want to see a fair world, want to see a moral world, want to see a world where certain people are not labeled as less than human, and where we can all live in peace and harmony without any fear that, once again, as a result of what's happening and the fact that Jews in general are increasingly being blamed for it, when I don't see it as their fault, that there may be an additional rise in anti-Semitism. And that would be a terrible tragedy, and a tragedy that you and I would end up having to fight against. That's one of the reasons I'm here today. I'm here today to say that we should stand in unity with our brothers and sisters in the Jewish community who are opposing what's happening here, and that we should join together to create a more humane and fair world.
Wow, well said, Sylvia. Thank you so much for this evening. We'll look forward to picking this up again, because there's so much more that we need to talk about. Thank you again.
Thank you, Regis.